When sculpting a crossbow, I begin very much the same way as I do with sculpting an armature for a regular miniature. You're going to need at least one pair of pliers. It's helpful to have two different kinds. And then snips and some wire. For this, I'm using 24 gauge steel, galvanized steel wire, just like I would with an armature. If this seems a little too loose to you, because it can be a little soft, you can go ahead and get some brass hobby wire, kind of like I use for my swords and things that I'm typically not bending very much, and use that instead. Just be a little careful when you bend it so it doesn't snap. But the key to setting up the crossbow armature is to take the one piece of wire, fold it in half. That becomes the stock, and then where the ends kind of point out, you bend them out and make a T shape, and that'll give you your crossbow. Once you've gotten that, I just did a couple little twists here just to help hold it together a little better. But you'll go ahead and do you'll want to mix up your putty and start by getting the base of the shaft worked out. So I've got my typical mix here of green stuff mixed with Aves. You probably won't be able to tell, but I actually didn't mix in quite enough Aves as I should have. I would recommend a 50-50 mix at the minimum. I did a little bit less on mine, and while it still filed pretty well, there were some soft points to where it just felt a little gummy and stuff was pulling. It wasn't quite as hard and crisp as I normally like. So you mix up your putty, place it on the armature, form it. I actually went ahead of time and bent the armature into kind of a bit of a more of an interesting shape. And just get your ruler as well. It's good. You want to make sure you're sighting the size of your crossbow. I think ultimately this came out to be maybe 2 millimeters wide. I might have got a little bit. I think I ended up a little thinner than that, but that's kind of where my base starting point was to be. Try and get it to about that width, and then just created the rest of the shape. But you do it all as much as you can with your fingers while it's wet. It'll save you a lot of time when you're filing if you get it to that point first. So here I've set the crossbow aside to cure. I used a putty oven just to speed things up, help make sure everything was fully cured. Just makes it that much easier to file down. And this was a little thicker than I planned. I can't remember if it ended up being 2 millimeters, but I needed it thinner. Whatever it was, though, I got my Dremel tool and just worked it down, especially on the sides where you're not trying to get any sort of finite finesse sort of shape. You just need to get it down to a certain distance. But you do have to be mindful when you do this on crossbows or any weapons, is you can see a little bit of pieces there, a little bit of shiny bits coming through. That's the wire, where I didn't have it quite lined up correctly when I started filing, so some of that's showing. But it's not a big deal as long as you make sure that it gets filed down along with the putty. You just have to be a little careful because the putty is softer than the wire, and so if you're not being mindful of what you're doing, the wire can end up bulging out of there. But if it's an issue, you can always put a little more putty over it and kind of correct and refile down and patch things up that way. Once I have kind of that general shape worked out, that's when I bring out just a large flat file. And from time to time, you might go in and trim off a couple pieces with a sharp exacto blade. Just be very careful. You don't want to cut your fingers. But you want to make sure you have a good bit of putty around the T section when you're making the body, because you want to make sure that the crossbow part, the bow part of the crossbow, has a lot of material there holding it in place. It'll just help it be a much more stable piece in the long run. So here I'm just working a little bit on the top and the bottom, just kind of getting that shape, checking the dimensions, and then I'm going to trim down the bow section. And I think originally this piece was about 20 millimeters long for the main shaft of the weapon, and so I thought I'd make the crossbow part about the same size. Here's a big tip that I didn't do. I checked this a little early on the miniature that it was going to go with, but if you have your sculpt done or fairly far along, obviously it wouldn't be done because you're still sculpting a weapon for it, but you want to check your weapon, your crossbow, against the sculpture to make sure that kind of it's the right size and proportions, especially when you're doing something maybe new like a crossbow that you aren't doing as often as you would with like a sword or shield. So anyways, I bent the bow part of the crossbow into shape, and then I got two pieces. I got one large piece of putty that I split in half, used the 50-50 trick that I do on try and do on a lot of things that are symmetrical that I sculpt. And once again, we're going to start pressing it onto the wire by hand, using a clay shaper if needed, to kind of give it a little bit more control of the shape. And we will do a little bit of filing on this, but if you do it right, and depending on what you're going for, if you want a very hard-edged surface, you'll want to do mainly filing. But in this case, most of the shape can be gotten just by sculpting it and putting it in hand, and then just doing a little bit of cleanup filing afterwards. So here it is again. This is once again, I've set the miniature aside, the sculpture aside to cure, and I'm going back and filing it. My number one file that I like to use for almost everything is just a large, flat file. The other ones I use, I'll have a small version of that, which you see, and then a rounded. And this happens to be the large rounded, but I'm usually use the smaller rounded. But you'll find that if you control your large or small flat file, you can actually work a lot of rounded shapes into the piece very easily by kind of working with the corner of the file rather than just the flat edge. And what I typically am using the round files for is when I'm trying to get a very specific rounded shape that matches up with the file a lot more. If you've got a much larger curve going on, it's usually better to kind of work it down with the large flat file. So here you saw that I ended up snipping off a little more excess, trying to make this a little smaller. And in just a second, you might notice that the crossbow changes quite a bit. It gets a lot smaller, and in both for the shaft and for the bow part. It's because I showed it to my son and he said, "That's way too big." So I ended up having to redo it for him, which he was right. It looks much better now, mounted on his dark elf miniature that I'm sculpting for him, that this crossbow will go to. One other thing I wanted to mention is whenever you're sculpting a weapon, it's good to have something to hold on to the piece while you're working with it. I've used two tools in this tutorial. The first one you saw was just a pair of forceps. They're my number one thing. They crimp onto all sorts of things very easily, but sometimes it can be a little unwieldy to hold it, and it kind of forces you to work from the figure from one angle. Well, the other thing you can do is you can actually take a drill bit and put the wire down in there, not the bit part, the actual pin vise part of the drill bit, and use that to hold it. Now right here I'm adding on a bolt for the crossbow, and I'm just taking a thin piece of brass wire and cutting it down to shape. Now you might think or be tempted to glue this piece onto the crossbow, the heft of it, but really you won't want to do that because it could mess up molding. And also, green stuff is very sticky putty, and that's kind of what it was designed for. It's designed as an adhesive covering element. So you can just put a very thin layer down there and then just clean it up some, and that piece will stay on there very nicely. So just make sure everything's aligned, clean it up with the clay shaper. Everything here is cured except for the little bit of putty I've placed on there for the arrow. And then, the crossbow at this point is basically done. All you really have to do is, decide if there's any other additional little details, maybe the lever that releases the bolt, actually putting on some of the feathering and the tip of the bolt, obviously, and I'm just putting on a little bit of a design on the side here. The last thought I want to leave you with is why I didn't do a rope or for the crossbow. And I'm kind of the mindset that that's something that a modeler will add themselves afterwards with a piece of string, because in reality it'd be so fine to have to sculpt it. It wouldn't cast very well, and it just creates a lot of complications with molding anyways. So I just typically choose to leave it off and let that be something that the end user can add when they actually assemble and paint the model themselves. And there you have it, the final crossbow attached to the miniature, still unfinished, the miniature, but the crossbow's done. And I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned how to add another weapon to your sculpting arsenal. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Remember, keep sculpting.